June 6, 1944, for 58 hours. The Normandy horizon was still a charcoal line, the kind that usually promised another quiet Atlantic dawn. A thin mist clung to the water, carrying the smell of salt, diesel, and wet concrete. Inside a German observation bunker above the cliffs near Longues-sur-Mer, an officer lifted his binoculars, more from routine than expectation. For weeks he had scanned the same empty sea, watching only fishing boats and restless gulls. The Atlantic wall, he had been told, was unbreakable. Then the horizon began to move. At first it looked like a trick of the light, scattered shadows where no shadows should be. The officer wiped the lenses and looked again. Shapes multiplied, stretching left and right until they swallowed the entire skyline. Ships of every size, silhouettes stacked behind silhouettes, funnels smoking, decks crowded with men and machinery. The low thunder of engines rolled across the channel like a distant storm. He felt the concrete floor tremble before the first shell was fired. Messages crackled through the field telephone, confused voices asking the same question: is this the invasion? Radar stations reported echoes they could not count. Artillery crews waited for orders that did not come. The officer lowered his binoculars, realizing he was witnessing something no German plan had truly imagined. Not a raid, not a probe, but an ocean carrying an army. And in that moment, staring at nearly 7,000 Allied vessels, he understood that the war had reached a point from which it could never return. By the summer of 1944, the war in Europe had entered a dangerous balance, poised between collapse and endurance. The Third Reich still controlled vast territory, from the Atlantic coast to the borders of the Soviet Union, yet its strength was no longer the strength of 1940. Years of fighting had drained Germany's manpower, its fuel reserves, and the certainty that had once driven its armies across the continent. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army was pushing west with relentless momentum. In Italy, Allied forces were grinding north toward Rome. And across the narrow strip of the English Channel, another storm had been gathering for years. Britain had become a vast armed camp. From the ports of Southampton, Portsmouth, and Plymouth stretched endless columns of tanks, trucks, ammunition crates, and fuel drums. American divisions, young, untested, and overwhelming in number, trained beside battle-hardened British and Canadian units. Airfields multiplied across the countryside, their runways crowded with bombers and fighters wearing fresh invasion stripes. By early 1944, more than 2 million Allied soldiers waited on the island, the largest amphibious force ever assembled in human history. German intelligence knew an invasion was coming. What they did not know was where. Since 1942, Hitler had ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, a chain of fortifications running from Norway to the Spanish border. Concrete bunkers, gun casemates, minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and miles of barbed wire were meant to turn the coastline into an iron barrier. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, doubted the wall's perfection but believed any landing could be crushed if reserves were released quickly. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, sent to inspect the defenses in late 1943, was less optimistic. He warned that the first 24 hours would decide everything. The enemy had to be destroyed on the beaches or not at all. Yet German preparations were shaped by uncertainty and deception. The Allies launched Operation Fortitude, an elaborate campaign of false radio traffic, dummy tanks, and phantom armies. To German analysts, the most logical target appeared to be the Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest crossing between England and France. There, heavy guns waited, divisions were concentrated, and commanders convinced themselves that geography would dictate Allied choices. Normandy, by comparison, seemed secondary, its beaches wide, its hinterland tangled with hedgerows, its ports small and vulnerable. German divisions stationed there were a mixture of veterans recovering from the Eastern Front, static units filled with older men, and foreign conscripts whose loyalty was uncertain. Fuel was scarce, transport limited, and training uneven. On paper the defenses looked formidable. In reality many positions lacked ammunition, communications lines were fragile, and air cover was almost non-existent. Above all hung the shadow of Allied air power. By 1944, the Luftwaffe could no longer contest the skies over France. German convoys moved only at night, bridges were destroyed as fast as they were repaired, and reconnaissance aircraft rarely returned with clear photographs. The Atlantic Wall faced an enemy it could not see and could not strike beyond the horizon. Inside German headquarters, the debate grew sharper. Rommel demanded that panzer divisions be placed close to the coast, ready to counterattack within hours. Rundstedt and others argued they must be held back, safe from Allied bombers, to deliver a decisive blow once the landing point was confirmed. Hitler, mistrustful of his generals, kept the final authority in his own hands, creating delays that would prove fatal. As May turned to June, weather reports predicted storms across the Channel. German meteorologists believed conditions would prevent any major operation. Many commanders left their posts for exercises or brief holidays. Rommel himself traveled to Germany for his wife's birthday, confident no invasion could occur under such skies. Along the Normandy coast, the routine continued. Radar stations tracked occasional patrols, coastal batteries practiced their firing tables, and observation officers watched an empty sea. The men in those bunkers had been told that if the Allies came, the Atlantic Wall would hold long enough for armored reserves to arrive and throw them back into the water. But across the Channel, Allied planners were preparing to gamble on a brief window of clearing weather, a decision that would carry thousands of ships toward the French coast. The German officer staring through his binoculars on that June morning did not yet know how many years of planning, deception, and hesitation were about to converge on the strip of beach below him. The world he believed solid was already beginning to crack. The German war machine that faced the Channel in 1944 was no longer the swift, unified force that had swept through France 4 years earlier. It had become a structure pulled in different directions, by rival commanders, by Hitler's interference, and by the slow erosion of resources. On maps the West there still appeared impressive, more than 50 divisions spread across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But many existed only on paper, their battalions under strength, their vehicles worn, their fuel allocations measured in liters rather than tons. The divisions guarding Normandy illustrated this decline. Some were static coastal units composed of older reservists, and men deemed unfit for the Eastern Front. Others were Ost battalions, made up of former Soviet prisoners wearing German uniforms out of necessity rather than conviction. A few elite formations. The 352nd Infantry Division, elements of the 21st Panzer, possessed real fighting power, yet even they lacked the mobility and air cover that modern warfare demanded. The Atlantic Wall gave the illusion of strength, but concrete could not replace men, radios, and ammunition. German commanders also struggled to interpret the flood of contradictory intelligence. Agents reported Allied concentrations in Kent and Sussex, pointing toward Calais. A captured French resistance message hinted at Normandy. Reconnaissance photographs showed unusual activity in dozens of British ports at once. The Allies wanted confusion, and they achieved it. The fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group, supposedly commanded by General Patton, existed only in radio signals and inflatable tanks, yet it held entire German armies in place far from the real target. Weather became another decisive actor. The Channel in early June was notorious for sudden gales and heavy seas. German forecasters, relying on limited Atlantic data, predicted a prolonged storm beginning on the 5th. Naval patrols were recalled, some coastal batteries relaxed their readiness. Officers believed that if the Allies intended to cross, they would wait for the long, calm days later in the month. The idea that an invasion might begin under gray skies and rough water seemed improbable. Meanwhile, the local population sensed the tension even if they did not know its cause. French farmers near the beaches noticed new minefields laid across familiar paths. Fishermen were forbidden to sail. Church bells were removed to prevent signaling. Trains carried endless loads of concrete and steel to the coast, yet the soldiers building the defenses often worked without clear plans. Orders arrived, were revised, then cancelled. In many sectors, the Atlantic Wall resembled a construction site frozen halfway through its blueprint. Inside the German chain of command, uncertainty hardened into paralysis. Hitler insisted that he alone would release the panzer divisions for counterattack. Telephones between headquarters required layers of authorization. Night exercises revealed how slowly units could move along bomb-damaged roads. Officers complained privately that the wall was more propaganda than protection, but such doubts never reached Berlin. Across the water, the Allies prepared with a unity Germany no longer possessed. American industry produced landing craft by the thousands. British scientists developed specialized vehicles to clear mines, bridges, and obstacles. Paratroopers rehearsed night drops over English fields that mimicked Norman villages. Every detail, tides, moonlight, beach gradients, was studied as if the fate of the world depended on centimeters and minutes. By the evening of June 5, German coastal positions settled into what seemed another ordinary watch. The wind howled off the channel, waves broke heavily against the obstacles, and many officers felt reassured. In the mess rooms, men played cards, convinced that any major assault was still weeks away. The Atlantic Wall, they believed, had bought them time. Yet far out at sea, engines were already turning. Convoys that stretched beyond the curvature of the earth were steering toward 5 narrow beaches whose names would soon enter history. The German officer on duty that night expected nothing more than routine reports. He could not know that within hours the assumptions of years would dissolve with the morning mist. The stage was set, the players in position, and the horizon waiting to reveal what the Atlantic Wall had never truly been built to face. Inside the concrete bunkers along the Normandy coast, war had a particular smell: damp cement, cold tobacco, machine oil rubbed into rifle bolts. The men stationed there were not the triumphant soldiers of 1940 but guards of a long, anxious vigil. Many had been pulled from quiet occupations in Germany: postal clerks, tram drivers, factory foremen. They had learned to live with the rhythm of alarms that usually meant nothing, with rumors that traveled faster than orders. On the night of June 5 they brewed thin coffee and listened to the Channel wind hammer the embrasures. Some wrote letters they could not mail, others slept in their boots. The youngest private in one battery near Omaha Beach was 17, the oldest over 40. Few had seen combat. Their officers repeated the same assurance: if the enemy comes, the wall will break him. Yet fear lived in small details. Ammunition boxes that arrived half-filled, telephones that failed during storms, the knowledge that Allied aircraft ruled the daylight hours. The soldiers joked about the invasion the way men joke about illness, pretending it belonged to someone else. When the first distant engines were heard before dawn, the jokes stopped. Human voices grew careful, thin, suddenly aware that history had chosen this particular morning. German strategy for the coast was built on a simple, brutal equation: delay, disrupt, and destroy before the Allies could expand inland. Beaches were layered with obstacles: Czech hedgehogs, steel ramps tipped with mines, wooden stakes meant to rip open landing craft. Behind them lay belts of barbed wire and killing zones pre-registered by artillery. Every gun position had firing tables calculated for specific tides. The concept assumed time would be on the defender's side. Coastal batteries would smash the first waves, infantry would contain any foothold, armored divisions would then arrive to deliver the final blow. On maps the system looked mathematical, almost elegant. In reality it depended on flawless communication and rapid decisions from a command structure famous for neither. Radar stations along the coast were supposed to provide early warning, but many had been blinded by Allied jamming. Telephone cables ran through exposed trenches that bombing had already severed in places. Even the obstacles on the beaches were incomplete, their positions sometimes guessed rather than surveyed. The tactical plan was a bridge built from assumptions, waiting for the weight of reality. The Atlantic Wall represented one kind of technology: concrete, steel, and the static power of heavy guns. The Allies approached with another: mobility, coordination, and industrial scale. German 88mm pieces were lethal weapons, yet many lacked the range to reach ships firing from far offshore. Coastal radar could detect echoes but could not distinguish between real convoys and the electronic ghosts the Allies projected across the channel. German soldiers had been trained to fight a war of fixed positions, while the enemy arriving that morning carried portable radios, waterproof vehicles, and specialized armor designed for the beaches themselves. The contrast was visible even before the first landing craft touched sand, a fortress culture facing a moving machine. For the officer at Longue-sur-Mer, technology revealed itself in layers. Through his binoculars he saw not individual ships but an entire system. Minesweepers clearing lanes, destroyers circling like guard dogs, aircraft weaving above in disciplined patterns. The Atlantic wall possessed powerful teeth, yet the armada approaching seemed to possess endless limbs. These three angles, the fragile human heart, the rigid tactical theory, and the unequal technologies, converged as the eastern sky began to pale. Each told a different story, yet all pointed toward the same conclusion forming in the minds of those watching the sea. The morning was about to test which vision of war would survive contact with the other. German command in the west resembled a machine with too many steering wheels. Field Marshal von Rundstedt held overall responsibility, but his authority was trimmed by Hitler's habit of personal control. Rommel, energetic and convinced that victory or defeat would be decided on the beaches, demanded immediate armored reserves near the coast. Others feared those tanks would be destroyed from the air before they could move. The compromise satisfied no one. On the eve of invasion, this divided leadership proved fatal. Several panzer divisions remained locked under Hitler's direct permission, a permission that could not be granted while he slept at the Berghof in Bavaria. Telephone operators hesitated to wake him. Orders traveled through layers of protocol while minutes, then hours, slipped away. The German officer watching the horizon belonged to this web of hesitation, brave men waiting for a clarity that never arrived. Across the water the Allies approached with a rare unity of purpose. American, British, Canadian, Polish, and Free French forces were bound by a single timetable. Their commanders had argued fiercely, yet once the plan was set it moved with mechanical confidence. Every soldier boarding a landing craft knew his beach, his sector, his objective beyond the dunes. To the Germans the enemy had long been a distant rumor carried by bombers. Now that enemy appeared as an organized civilization afloat. Hospital ships painted white, tank landing craft with ramps like jaws, destroyers bristling with antennas. The contrast unsettled even veteran observers. They had expected an assault. They had not imagined an exodus of nations. Propaganda had taught German troops to view the Allies as hesitant and divided. The sight of that coordinated fleet challenged years of indoctrination. For the first time, many defenders understood they were not facing an opponent, but an alliance whose resources seemed to exceed geography itself. War is often measured in calibers and divisions, yet beneath those numbers lies a quieter arithmetic, the question of belief. By 1944, confidence within Germany had eroded. Families mourned sons lost at Stalingrad and Kursk. Cities burned under nightly bombing. Ration cards grew thinner each month. The Atlantic wall promised safety, but it could not rebuild faith. Among the soldiers in Normandy there lingered a sense that they were guarding the edge of a crumbling world. Some still believed in victory, others only in duty, many in nothing more than survival. The approaching fleet forced a moral reckoning. To fight meant defending a regime that demanded absolute obedience. To surrender meant betraying oaths sworn under fear. The German officer with the binoculars felt this conflict without naming it. He had trained to repel invaders, yet the scale before him suggested something larger than defense, a tide of history correcting its course. In that instant the war ceased to be abstract and became a personal verdict. These angles, leadership trapped by its own structure, an enemy unified beyond expectation, and the inner doubts of those ordered to resist, formed the unseen battlefield beneath the physical one. They shaped how every gun would be fired and every order obeyed as the first Allied shells began to arc toward the coast. The horizon was no longer only a line between sea and sky. It had become a mirror reflecting the strengths and fractures of two worlds about to collide. 5:30 hours. The channel changed its voice. What had been a distant murmur hardened into a continuous metallic growl, the sound of thousands of engines working against the tide. Through the observation slits the German officer saw the first shapes detach from the main armada, destroyers sliding forward like gray knives, minesweepers drawing careful paths toward the coast. The sea, usually empty at this hour, was suddenly crowded with intention. Then the bombardment began. Naval guns spoke in long orange flashes from beyond the horizon. Seconds later the air above the cliffs tore apart with a pressure that punched the lungs. Concrete dust rained from the ceiling of the bunker. Telephone receivers jumped in their cradles. Every pre-registered German position, every battery mapped by Allied reconnaissance, was struck in methodical rhythm. The Atlantic wall answered with its own fire, but the reply sounded thin against the weight coming from the sea. Reports arrived confused and incomplete. Radar stations at Douvres-la-Delivrande had been jammed since midnight. Coastal observation posts could see only fragments through smoke and spray. One message claimed paratroopers were already behind the lines, another insisted the main attack would still fall at Calais. The chain of command began to tremble under the flood of contradictions. Outside, the sky filled with aircraft. Bombers crossed in disciplined waves, their engines blending into a single ceiling of sound. German anti-aircraft guns fired desperately, but the formations barely wavered. To the defenders it felt less like a battle than a storm with a human center. The officer focused his binoculars on the nearest sector of beach. He watched small craft detach from larger transports, forming lines that pointed directly toward the sand. They moved slowly, burdened with men and equipment, yet their number seemed to renew itself each time a wave disappeared into smoke. He tried to count them and stopped. Counting had lost meaning. At 6:10 the coastal battery received orders to engage landing craft at maximum range. The gunners, hands shaking inside their gloves, swung the barrels toward the sea. Their first salvos fell short, raising white columns of water among the approaching boats. Correcting the aim required telephone links that were already failing. Each minute of delay belonged to the enemy. Inside the command post maps were spread across a table already dusted with plaster. Officers argued over symbols that no longer matched reality. One insisted the attack was only a diversion. Another demanded immediate release of the panzer divisions. The authority to decide lay hundreds of kilometers away, sleeping. Along the beaches the first Allied troops were climbing into their landing craft, unaware of the individual German faces watching them. For the defenders the war condensed into narrow rectangles of vision, a ramp lowering, a machine gun position, a stretch of wire. The grand strategy of empires dissolved into personal angles and trembling trigger fingers. The officer felt the bunker shudder as a heavy shell struck nearby. For a moment the lights failed, leaving only the pale glow from the embrasures. In that darkness he understood how small his post was compared to what approached. The Atlantic wall, praised in speeches and newsreels, now seemed like a line drawn in sand before the tide. At 6:30 the first landing craft touched the outer obstacles. Some exploded on mines, others threaded through gaps cleared by Allied engineers. Figures in wet uniforms spilled onto the beach and began to move forward in short, determined runs. German machine guns opened fire, cutting bright seams across the morning haze. The battle, long imagined, had finally become physical. Yet even as the defenders fought, the scale of the armada continued to unfold behind the initial waves. New ships appeared where others had been, an endless conveyor from the horizon. The officer realized that destroying the first line would not end the assault. It would only reveal the next. Messages from neighboring sectors told the same story: paratroopers blocking roads inland, gliders landing artillery behind the beaches, naval guns silencing batteries one by one. The carefully designed system of defense was being taken apart simultaneously at every joint. Standing at the observation slit, the officer felt a slow, heavy certainty settle over him. Courage remained, training remained, but the arithmetic no longer belonged to Germany. What he witnessed was not merely an attack on a coastline, It was the arrival of another age. And the day had only begun. By mid-morning the battle had fragmented into hundreds of separate struggles, yet the overall direction was unmistakable. The German plan required coordination, the reality delivered chaos. Telephone lines lay severed beneath bomb craters, messengers were cut down on exposed roads, and radio frequencies drowned in Allied interference. Each bunker fought its private war while the larger picture slipped away. At the Long-sur-Mer battery, the officer watched smoke thicken across the beaches until it blurred the horizon he had studied for years. Naval shells continued to arrive with mechanical patience, adjusting closer to the gun positions. One casemate to the west fell silent after a direct hit, another fired until its ammunition elevator jammed with debris. The Atlantic wall was not collapsing in a single moment, but eroding like a cliff under relentless surf. Word reached the post that Hitler had finally been informed. Authorization to move the panzer divisions was requested, debated, and postponed. Some armored units began to roll toward Normandy, only to be halted by air attacks that turned roads into burning corridors. The doctrine of a swift counterstroke dissolved in columns of black smoke visible even from the coast. On the beaches below, Allied soldiers pushed through the first belt of obstacles. Engineers blew gaps in the wire while medics dragged the wounded behind improvised cover. The German officer could see individual figures now, a man signaling with a flag, another carrying a flamethrower, groups sheltering behind knocked-out craft. The enemy was no longer an abstract mass but thousands of separate wills moving in the same direction. German resistance remained fierce in places. Machine gun nests inflicted terrible losses. Some positions fought until buried under naval fire. Yet every minute brought more Allied troops ashore, more tanks rumbling off landing craft, more artillery being dragged across the sand. The balance of weight tipped irreversibly. Shortly after 10 a.m. Runner arrived with orders to prepare for close defense. Paratroopers had been reported near the battery's rear, cutting the road to Bayeux. The officer understood what that meant. They were becoming an island in a rising sea. Ammunition stocks were counted, water rationed, escape routes considered and dismissed. From the observation slit he saw the first Allied warships move dangerously close to shore, firing point-blank at remaining strongpoints. The concussion rocked the cliffs like an earthquake. Concrete that had seemed eternal cracked along thin, vulnerable lines. Men who had trusted those walls felt them shudder like living flesh. The decisive realization came not in a single revelation but in accumulation. Every report told the same story: beaches held, exits forced, reinforcements landing without pause. The Atlantic Wall had not bought time, it had merely recorded the speed of defeat. The officer lowered his binoculars and understood that he was witnessing the end of an illusion nurtured since 1940. Around noon the battery received fragmented news from higher command acknowledging multiple Allied bridgeheads. The word, invasion, was finally used without qualification. Yet no coherent counterattack existed, only scattered attempts by units already outflanked. The German system, built on centralized decisions, had been struck at the one point it could not adapt. The officer stepped outside the bunker for the first time since dawn. The air smelled of cordite and burning grass. To the west he could hear the steady thunder from Omaha and Gold. To the east, similar storms over Juneau and Sword. The entire coastline had become a single front wider than any he had imagined. He thought of the maps that had promised containment, of speeches describing the Atlantic Wall as impregnable, of the quiet mornings when the sea looked harmless. None of that survived the view before him. Thousands of Allied vehicles already moving inland, columns forming on roads German planners believed secure. In that moment the war changed its character. It was no longer a question of repelling an assault but of enduring an occupation force arriving by the hour. The officer felt neither panic nor relief, only a heavy clarity. History had chosen its direction with the indifference of the tide. As afternoon approached, new waves of landing craft continued to emerge from the smoke, and the horizon that had once been empty remained filled beyond measure. The German defenders were brave, many would fight to the end, but bravery could not alter the mathematics unfolding along the Normandy shore. The turning point was complete, written not in orders but in the unbroken line of ships stretching farther than the eye could follow. By evening of June 6 the beaches of Normandy no longer resembled separate battlefields but a single, sprawling port of arrival. More than 150,000 Allied soldiers had come ashore in the first 24 hours, supported by nearly 7,000 vessels and over 11,000 aircraft. The Atlantic Wall, designed to prevent precisely this moment, had been pierced at 5 points that now widen like open doors. German situation reports painted a bleak mosaic. At Omaha and Gold the defenders had been pushed back from the bluffs. At Juneau and Sword Canadian and British troops were advancing toward Cannes. At Utah the Americans linked with airborne units dropped deep in the Cotentin. Casualties were heavy on both sides, yet the balance of loss favored the attacker who could replace men and machines without pause. Inside headquarters the language of the messages changed from confidence to containment. Orders no longer spoke of throwing the enemy into the sea but of delaying him long enough for a new line to be formed. The very vocabulary admitted defeat. The panzer divisions released too late now struggled to reach the front through skies ruled by Allied fighters. Columns were destroyed at crossroads before firing a single shot. For the German officer at Longues-sur-Mer the aftermath arrived in quieter forms. Ammunition dwindled, medical supplies disappeared, and wounded men lay in corridors where maps had once hung. Civilians from nearby villages sought shelter, carrying rumors faster than any radio. Some spoke of entire towns already in Allied hands, others claimed reinforcements were coming from Paris. No one could verify anything. During the night scattered counterattacks flared and died. A few German units fought with remarkable tenacity, holding villages for hours against overwhelming odds. Yet each isolated success was swallowed by the broader tide. The Allies poured prefabricated harbors, fuel pipelines, and endless convoys onto the beaches, transforming them from targets into engines of advance. Statistics began to replace emotions. German losses on the first day were estimated in the tens of thousands, though exact numbers would never be known. Hundreds of guns were destroyed or captured, entire battalions ceased to exist as coherent formations. The Atlantic Wall, once advertised as a masterpiece of engineering, was reduced to a chain of ruins photographed by Allied reconnaissance. Berlin demanded explanations. Reports emphasized weather miscalculations, enemy deception, and the unexpected scale of the Armada. Rarely did they mention the deeper causes: years of strategic overreach, the draining war in the East, and a command system paralyzed by fear of disobedience. The officer reading these communiques sensed how truth thinned as it traveled upward. For the French population the aftermath carried its own contradictions. Liberation arrived with shellfire that destroyed homes and fields. Villagers emerged from cellars to find foreign armies fighting in their streets, speaking languages they had heard only on forbidden radios. Joy mixed with grief, gratitude with the shock of sudden freedom paid for by neighbors' lives. The German defenders faced personal reckonings. Some prepared to fight on out of conviction or habit. Others considered surrender, weighing the oath they had sworn against the reality before them. The officer remembered the horizon of that morning and knew which voice sounded stronger. The war he had been ordered to defend no longer existed in the form he had imagined. As June 7 dawned, Allied troops were already pushing beyond the beaches toward Bayeux, Corentin, and Cannes. Engineers laid temporary roads across the sand, and supply depots grew where obstacles had stood. The invasion was no longer an event but a fact, irreversible as the rising sun. The first chapter of Normandy had closed with the defenders still fighting yet already overtaken by time. What remained was the long unraveling, the months of retreat, the battles in hedgerows, and the slow march toward Germany itself. The officer folded his binoculars, understanding that the scene he witnessed would be remembered long after individual names were forgotten. In the days that followed, the meaning of June 6 settled over the German command like a long shadow. What had been described as a temporary breach hardened into a permanent front stretching from the Orne River to the Cotentin Peninsula. Allied engineers erected artificial harbors at airmanches, floating miracles of steel that allowed thousands of tons of supplies to flow ashore each day. The very sea that Germany had hoped would be an ally became the enemy's greatest highway. German attempts to regain initiative arrived piecemeal. The 21st Panzer Division struck near Caen but was driven back by naval gunfire that reached far inland. The elite Panzerlehr, rushed from the interior, lost entire columns to Allied fighter bombers before meeting the enemy on the ground. Every movement during daylight became an invitation to destruction from the air. The battlefield no longer belonged to those who maneuvered fastest but to those who controlled the sky. For the officer and the remnants of his battery, survival replaced strategy. Orders instructed them to hold positions that maps already marked as lost. Food arrived irregularly. Water was carried from shattered villages. The wounded were evacuated on carts when vehicles could be found, often under white flags improvised from bed sheets. Discipline remained, yet it was the discipline of men clinging to routine while the structure around them dissolved. Rumors about the wider war filtered through. In the east, Soviet armies were preparing a colossal summer offensive. In Italy, Rome had fallen to the Allies only 2 days before the Normandy landings. The officer realized that the beaches he had watched were not an isolated crisis, but one gate in a closing ring. Germany was fighting on too many horizons at once. French civilians began to return cautiously to their homes, carrying the quiet courage of ordinary life. They shared bread with prisoners, guided medics to hidden wells, and buried the dead without asking for uniforms. Their presence reminded the German soldiers that the land they defended was not truly theirs, that the war had always been fought across someone else's fields and kitchens. By mid-June the Allied bridgehead exceeded 100 kilometers in width. More than 1 million men would be ashore before the month ended. The Atlantic Wall existed only as a memory photographed by war correspondents: twisted steel, broken casemates, and the silent mouths of guns pointing toward an empty sea. What had taken years to build had been overcome in hours. German high command searched for scapegoats. Meteorologists were blamed for the misforecast, intelligence officers for believing Allied deceptions, generals for lacking resolve. Yet the deeper failure lay in a system that mistook concrete for strategy and obedience for strength. The officer reading these debates felt detached, as if listening to arguments about a house already burned to its foundations. Some defenders chose surrender when opportunity allowed, preferring captivity to a hopeless retreat. Others fought on through the hedgerows, their determination earning grudging respect from the enemy. The officer's own fate became uncertain. Transfer, capture, or death were possibilities that changed with each order. What remained constant was the memory of that first sight of the Armada, the moment certainty broke like glass. Across Europe, the news of the landings ignited hope among occupied peoples. Resistance groups emerged from the shadows, sabotaging rail lines and guiding Allied patrols. The psychological front shifted as decisively as the military one. Germany was no longer the advancing power but the besieged. Looking back from the ruined bunker, the officer understood that he had witnessed more than a battle. He had seen the turning of an era, when industrial might and coalition unity overwhelmed the fortress mentality. The Atlantic Wall had promised permanence. The horizon had delivered change. As summer deepened, the sounds of Normandy moved farther inland, leaving the coast strangely quiet. Gulls returned to the cliffs, circling above wrecked landing craft that rusted in the surf. The sea looked once again like an ordinary sea, but those who had watched it on the morning of June 6 would never believe in its innocence again. The aftermath continued to unfold, carrying the war toward Paris, toward the Rhine, and eventually toward Berlin. Yet, for many German soldiers, the decisive moment remained that first day when nearly 7,000 ships appeared and a single officer realized resistance had become a gesture rather than a strategy. June 6, 1944, was more than a date on the calendar. It was a reckoning, a moment when history revealed the scale of what human organization and determination could accomplish. From the cliffs of Normandy, a German officer witnessed the impossible: thousands of ships, tens of thousands of soldiers, and a tide of machines moving in precise unity. The Atlantic Wall, years in construction and long celebrated as invincible, crumbled not with a single strike but under the relentless weight of coordination, courage, and industrial power. In that morning mist, the war changed character. It became clear that victory no longer depended on fortifications alone, on tradition, or even on individual bravery. It demanded vision, logistics, and the ability to move entire nations in concert. The officer, and countless soldiers like him, would carry the memory of that horizon for the rest of their lives, a lesson in scale, inevitability, and human endeavor. Today, we reflect on Normandy not only for its strategy and statistics but for the human dimension, the fear, the resolve, and the fleeting moments of recognition that history is larger than any one of us. It is a reminder that courage exists even when defeat is certain, and that ordinary individuals often witness extraordinary forces at work. If you are watching this, comment where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family took part in World War II. Remember to like and subscribe. Sharing history keeps it alive, and every view honors the men and women who faced those impossible mornings on the shores of Normandy. History was witnessed, recorded, and lived. And in understanding it, we honor those moments still echoing across time.